We are fundamentally conditioned to believe this really simple equation. Richer countries are safer, and poorer countries are dangerous.
Yeah, it's a very deeply ingrained assumption.
But today's source material is going to prove that instinct completely wrong. So picture a dark, quiet street in a lower income neighborhood. And now, contrast that, picture a bustling avenue in, one of the richest megacities on earth.
Right, lots of foot traffic.
Exactly. It's filled with people walking around carrying $1,000 smartphones. They're wearing expensive smartwatches, designer bags, just, the works. Which of those two environments is more dangerous?
I mean, most people would say the dark street, right?
Oh, 100%. Your instinct probably screams that the dark, modest street is the threat. So welcome to today's deep dive. Our mission today for you listening is to basically shatter that baseline assumption and explore this truly fascinating dynamic called the wealth risk paradox.
And it is fascinating because the underlying data reveals a pretty profound contradiction. When you actually analyze the global metrics, some of the world's most affluent, like high GDP nations, are currently struggling with rampant opportunistic theft and massive waves of cybercrime and just a deep underlying social fragmentation.
Right.
But then conversely, certain lower income countries, places we typically associate with much higher risk, they actually boast these incredibly tight-knit, highly secure communities.
Wow.
Where the everyday risk to an individual just, walking down the street is surprisingly low.
Which completely flips the script on how we think about safety. And to map this out for you, we are working from just an incredible stack of sources today.
Oh, yeah, the data pool is massive.
It really is. Our anchor for this deep dive is this highly comprehensive March 2026 article. But, the author didn't just share opinions. This is backed by heavy-hitting aggregated data.
Right, we're talking about the World Bank, the Interpol, and Pew Research. We even have sociocultural frameworks drawn from major sociologists like Zygmunt Bauman and Manuel Castells.
Right, to actually explain the human behavior behind all these numbers.
Because the synthesis of all those institutions, it points to this single, undeniable reality. To understand modern security, looking at a country's gross domestic product is practically useless. We have to look at visibility, social signaling, and the mechanisms of how modern economies have entirely changed the psychological nature of crime.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because, why doesn't a massive economy just buy perfect safety?
Right.
If a country is wealthy, the assumption is that the wealth creates a fortress, So let's start by dissecting the wealthy side of this paradox.
Well, economic prosperity obviously funds tremendous physical and institutional advantages. A high GDP nation can afford highly trained police forces, ubiquitous surveillance infrastructure, robust legal systems, all of that.
Sure, the traditional markers of a safe society.
Exactly, but the paradox emerges because that very same wealth inherently creates entirely new, highly concentrated forms of vulnerability. Wealth, just by its nature, concentrates really valuable assets into very dense geographic areas.
So the environment itself actually changes the fundamental motivation of the criminal.
That is the mechanical shift happening here, yeah. In high-income societies, the data shows crime undergoing this evolutionary step. It moves aggressively away from being survival-driven.
Okay, survival-driven meaning?
Like the traditional model where someone steals basic goods or money because they literally need to secure food or shelter.
Right, desperation.
Exactly. But in wealthy environments, crime becomes opportunity-driven. The theft is no longer about desperation. It's about the sheer accessibility and density of visible, highly desirable, highly liquid goods.
Okay, and our primary source refers to this dynamic as gadget as status.
Yeah.
And this concept is, it's going to feel incredibly relatable for you listening right now.
Oh, absolutely.
Because if you are walking through a wealthy financial district with $300 noise-canceling headphones on your ears and a $1,200 smartphone in your hand, you are essentially walking around as a glowing loot drop in a video game.
A glowing loot drop. That is the perfect way to describe it.
Right, because you're broadcasting a signal to the entire street going, hey, I am carrying highly liquid, easily transportable wealth.
Yeah.
You aren't just a person anymore. You've become a moving display of value.
And that analogy captures the exact mechanism of the vulnerability, because it is all about visibility. A modern smartphone is no longer just a communication utility. It is a marker of identity, belonging, social hierarchy.
Yeah, it's a status symbol.
Exactly. And opportunistic crime is fueled by the absolute ease with which those visible assets can be snatched from a hand and converted into anonymous cash.
Right.
The thief isn't targeting you out of starvation. They're targeting you because you chose to visibly hold a universally tradable commodity right there in a public space.
So the visibility itself is the liability, not necessarily the object.
There is a remarkably precise quote from the podcaster.capital text that synthesizes this perfectly. The author writes, "In a world of visible wealth, security is no longer about what you own, but how visibly you own it."
How visibly you own it. Wow. That really reorients the whole concept of personal security.
It really does.
But, okay, let me push back on this a little bit on behalf of the listener, because my brain is still flashing warning signs about that dark street we pictured at the very beginning.
Sure, the conditioning runs deep.
It does. If wealth creates a landscape of moving targets, what happens in a fundamentally impoverished environment? Doesn't the structural instability, the lack of resources, the economic hardship in a lower income country automatically breed a more desperate, survival-driven criminal element?
It's a very natural assumption to make, but the sociological data proves that this is exactly where our cognitive biases lead us astray. The reports clarify a really critical distinction between systemic risk and everyday individual vulnerability.
Okay, break that down for me.
So poverty absolutely increases systemic risk. Lower income country might suffer from weaker overarching government institutions or, poorly funded public infrastructure, limited emergency response.
The macro level stuff.
Exactly. But that macro level instability does not automatically translate into a high probability that you, as an individual, will be targeted on a neighborhood street.
Because the environment simply doesn't support that glowing loot drop economy we just talked about.
That is the foundational math of it, yeah. Without a massive saturation of high-value, highly liquid goods just walking around on the sidewalk, there is minimal incentive for opportunity-driven street theft.
Makes sense. The ecosystem for that specific crime just doesn't exist.
Right. But there's a much more profound mechanism at play here, too. The true protection in these lower income communities, it doesn't come from physical infrastructure like alarms or cameras. It comes from human infrastructure.
You mean like the informal social networks of the people living there?
Yes. Poorer communities often rely entirely on informal social networks out of necessity. People actually know the people who live on their street.
What a concept.
Right. There is an incredibly high degree of social accountability. If you walk into a tight-knit neighborhood where generations of families live in really close proximity, the residents are highly attuned to who belongs and who is a stranger.
Yeah, you stick out immediately.
Exactly. And that intense hyper-local awareness acts as a built-in organic protective system. Random opportunistic crime is heavily deterred by the simple fact of community oversight.
I find the cultural context around this so fascinating, because in many societies with lower GDPs, sharing resources is completely normalized.
Yeah.
And that community oversight is just the default setting for daily life.
Right. It's just how society functions.
Contrast that with wealthier societies, where we heavily prioritize rigid individual ownership, like we want our privacy, we build 6-foot fences, we pull our cars into attached garages so we never even have to speak to the person living next door.
And in our pursuit of privacy and hyper-individualism, we systematically dismantle our own social bonds. We essentially isolate ourselves in fortresses of wealth.
Wow.
You might have a state-of-the-art cloud-connected security system on your front door, but if you don't know the name of the neighbor living 20 feet away, you have zero human infrastructure.
Right. If someone breaches your home, there is no community alarm, just an electronic one that alerts some distant monitoring center.
Exactly. And, we also have to address the massive perception gap here.
Oh, the media.
Yes. The media environment in wealthy nations is hyper-focused on amplifying crime reporting. You see a viral video of a phone snatching on your local evening news, and suddenly your brain categorizes your entire zip code as a war zone.
Yeah, your anxiety just skyrockets.
But the perception of danger is vastly different from the statistical reality of danger. Wealthy countries possess the technological infrastructure to report, record, and broadcast every single crime.
Right, it's everywhere.
Conversely, in many lower-income nations, significant underreporting complicates the raw data. So this makes a pure one-to-one statistical comparison difficult, but it highlights a crucial psychological truth.
Which is?
The anxiety and fear you feel walking down the street is often completely detached from the actual mathematical probability of you experiencing a crime.
Okay, so if dense wealth creates a target-rich environment, and poverty can sometimes offer the organic armor of tight-knit human networks, then the true catalyst for danger must be the collision of those two realities.
Yes, and the World Bank and OECD data isolate this exact collision as the primary driver of global crime rates.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The critical bridge determining the safety of a society isn't its overall GDP. The ultimate multiplier of risk is inequality.
The disparity itself.
Exactly. And I want to pause here for you listening just to clarify our framework, because we are strictly unpacking the sociological data provided in these reports.
Right, there's no agenda here.
No, none at all. We aren't taking any political stance on capitalism, economic systems, or wealth distribution. We're purely looking at the mathematical correlation between highly unequal environments and specific crime dynamics.
And the data is entirely objective on this point. Highly unequal societies, regardless of whether the nation itself is classified as wealthy or developing, they experience the highest, most volatile crime rates. Visible disparity is the engine of risk.
Because the wealth isn't just present, it's aggressively in your face.
Right. It creates a massive daily aspiration gap. When individuals who are structurally barred from economic advancement are forced to constantly navigate around lavish lifestyles and highly visible displays of wealth, it generates deep sociological tension.
I mean, how could it not?
Exactly. The temptation to acquire those symbols of success, whether through legal channels or, you know what I mean?
Right.
It compounds exponentially.
And the source material introduces a concept here that frames a very common social attitude as a literal security threat. They call it snobbishness. And the text isn't using that word to describe someone turning their nose up at a dinner party. It defines snobbishness as a systematic, deliberate way of signaling superiority through consumption.
It is the weaponization of status signaling.
That is a great way to phrase it. It is ensuring that every stranger you pass knows exactly how much disposable income you have based on like the logo on your bag or the hardware on your wrist.
Right.
By aggressively signaling that superiority, you aren't just being arrogant. You are actively increasing the desirability of those specific goods and forcing a social comparison onto everyone around you.
You are artificially raising the temperature of the entire social ecosystem. When status is aggressively and constantly displayed, the divisions within a society become undeniable, They become pronounced.
So you can't ignore it.
This behavior fuels intense aspiration in those who lack the items and breeds deep frustration in those who feel permanently excluded from that tier of society. A person flaunting a luxury item might have zero intention of causing harm, but the sociological reality is that the act of display directly triggers risk dynamics for themselves and their community.
Let's bring in the exact quote from the text because it nails this concept. Snobbishness doesn't just divide society, it quietly rewires the risks within it.
Rewiring the risk. It's the perfect phrasing. It completely changes the psychological landscape of a city.
So if inequality is the fuel for this rewiring, the physical design of our modern world must be the engine. How do these socioeconomic factors manifest in the actual layout of where we live?
Well, the primary amplifier is modern urbanization. The protective human infrastructure we discussed earlier, the neighborhood that is completely dismantled by the structural reality of the megacity.
Right.
Urbanization manufactures anonymity on an industrial scale.
In a city of 10 million people, you are surrounded by humanity, but you are entirely invisible to them. You are completely anonymous.
And anonymity drastically reduces social accountability. When you combine high population density, incredibly high-value visible assets, and the utter social fragmentation of a megacity, you create the optimal environment for opportunity-driven crime.
The organic community shield is just gone.
Gone, replaced by a sea of strangers carrying liquid wealth.
And the local street corner is no longer a closed system either. We have to factor in the globalization of the black market. Because of global interconnectedness, the value of that stolen phone is universal.
Oh, absolutely.
The culture, the branding, the aspirations, they all flow seamlessly across borders.
The incentive structure for theft has been completely decoupled from the local economy. I mean, a desirable piece of technology in London is equally desirable in Jakarta or Bogota.
So a smartphone swiped from a cafe table in a wealthy, anonymous megacity doesn't stay in that city. The person who stole it is essentially just the local collection agent for a massive global supply chain.
That's exactly what it is.
That device can be rapidly moved through expanding international resale networks. The criminal isn't stealing for their own use. They are harvesting global currency.
But keeping that stolen hardware in the physical world is becoming increasingly difficult due to, advanced tracking and biometric locks.
Right, you can just brick the phone remotely now.
Exactly. So the criminal incentive is shifting once again. The actors who previously harvested gadgets on the street are realizing there is an infinitely larger, entirely invisible vault they can access without ever leaving a desk.
The digital landscape. This completely changes the mechanics of the wealth risk paradox.
What's fascinating here is what the source material categorizes as the digital layer of security risk. This is the space where the wildly different risk profiles between a citizen in a high GDP country and a citizen in a lower income country actually begin to mathematically equalize.
Wait, let me make sure I understand the mechanics of this.
Right.
A wealthy person in a high GDP nation has vastly more digital exposure, right?
Yeah.
Linked bank accounts, automated investment portfolios, digitized health records, high credit limits.
Yep, a huge digital footprint.
So while they are insulated by physical police forces and gated communities, their digital footprint makes them a highly lucrative target for a cyber attack.
That is the exact vulnerability. Affluent populations are currently facing a catastrophic wave of cybercrime. We are talking about highly sophisticated data breaches, synthetic identity theft, and automated financial fraud.
Wow.
A person sitting in a statistically safe, highly policed suburb might never face physical violence, but they are constantly exposed to the risk of having their entire financial identity erased by an invisible actor halfway across the globe.
Meanwhile, a person living in a lower income country with less digital integration might face higher physical risks in their daily transit, but their exposure to catastrophic global cyber fraud is relatively minimal.
Exactly. And when you overlay those two realities, the physical threat vector and the digital threat vector, the total aggregate risk profile between the wealthy citizen and the lower income citizen becomes shockingly similar.
That is wild.
They aren't facing more or less risk. The threats are simply operating on entirely different frequencies.
And this brings us to the ultimate synthesis of this entire deep dive. The text draws heavily on sociological theorists like Manuel Castells and Zygmunt Bauman to suggest that this isn't just a trend in crime.
No, it's much bigger than that.
We are experiencing what they call a civilizational consciousness shift.
That is the grand unifying theory of the paradox. Human societies are fundamentally transitioning away from a survival-based value system and moving toward an identity-based value system.
Wait, so if we are moving from survival to identity-based values, does that mean we are actually guarding our social media profiles, our digital avatars, and our status symbols with the exact same primal instinct our ancestors used to guard their physical homes and food supplies?
That is the exact psychological mechanism at play, yeah. For the vast majority of human history, security was purely biological. It meant protecting the physical body from harm, securing a food source, finding shelter.
Or the basics.
But today, in our hyper-networked era, security is increasingly defined by the protection of symbolic value. We have essentially commodified our identities.
So the objects aren't just tools anymore.
The smartphones, the wearables, the digital accounts, they hold immense symbolic power. They are the physical manifestation of who we are to the rest of society.
Wow.
In this new civilizational paradigm, security is no longer just about deadbolting a wooden door. It is about aggressively protecting the symbols and the data that define our existence. And as we established at the very beginning of this conversation, the more visibly you display that identity, the more vulnerable it becomes.
So what does this all mean? If we zoom out and look at the massive amount of data we've covered today, the core takeaway is absolute. Wealth does not guarantee safety. In fact, wealth complicates safety.
It really does.
Security is not a static product you can just, purchase off a shelf.
Yeah.
It is a highly dynamic, incredibly fragile system. It is dictated entirely by how wealth is distributed, how aggressively it is displayed, and how it is perceived by the anonymous strangers we share our cities with.
And achieving true safety in the modern era requires a completely holistic approach. It requires us to collectively turn down the dial on that excessive status signaling, snobbishness that actively rewires the risk in our neighborhoods.
Right.
It demands that we fiercely adapt our defenses to invisible digital threats. But perhaps most importantly, it requires us to do the incredibly hard, unglamorous work of rebuilding actual human infrastructure.
Rebuilding community networks instead of just upgrading our physical locks. I want you, the listener, to evaluate your own visible footprint today. When you walk out your front door, are your gadgets just tools that serve a utilitarian purpose? Or have they become targets because you are subconsciously using them to signal your status to a world of anonymous strangers?
Are you a walking loot drop?
Exactly. Are you walking around as a glowing loot drop? Understanding this paradox requires a fundamental shift in how we view our daily habits.
It does, and it leaves us with a rather profound question about where human security is heading next. We have established that our physical gadgets and the visible way we flaunt them are the primary magnets for opportunistic risk today. But technology is rapidly shrinking.
It's getting smaller every year.
Right. So what happens in the very near future when our technology becomes entirely invisible? When our digital identities, our bank accounts, and our social status are managed by smart.
Oh, wow.
Will the wealth risk paradox finally disappear because we can no longer visibly signal our status to a stranger on the street? Or will the nature of crime simply evolve yet again? Will we move from a world where thieves snatch physical possessions from our hands to a world where they attempt to hack our minds?
That is a terrifying yet completely logical progression of the data. And it brings us right back to that split-screen image we started with. The mountain of gleaming, visible luxury on one side and the dark, quiet street on the other. It turns out the brightest, most visible things in our world are often the most fragile.
The paradox remains intact.
That is definitely something to think about the next time you pull out your phone in a crowded city. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Stay curious, stay safe, and we'll catch you on the next one.